South Africa and the US in the past decade and a half actually had been through a very up and down trade relations, not only in agriculture, but in other areas as well. Being a South African, I'll obviously try to focus on this South African side. I mean, this relationship, as I said, it has history, but my key point today is try to get into the future, move beyond today. Because to be quite honest, where we are today in terms of this trade relationship, South Africa and the US, we've been there before. 4 years ago, 2008, 2009, we were talking about the very same issue. Maybe one or two that is new, but the entire discussion, contentious issues are not entirely new. And the question is, can the WTO step in and deal with some of the issues? Let's take an example about the letter that was sent to the South African government threatening to suspend the AGOA agreement. Within the WTO setup, does South Africa have a recourse? But the WTO is also there not only for South Africa, US, but as an institution that regulates the global trade. These kind of things, they happen quite a lot. But does the WTO always have a mechanism given the current setup between South Africa and the United States? Yes or no, for me, the idea or what I would like us as South Africans to focus on or to think about is that we know that AGOA, which is basically the agreement under which we trade with the United States, has been extended with another 10 years. But currently, as it is, AGOA being a non-reciprocal agreement, it's one-sided. And that's not the US fault. It is one-sided in the sense that the US can, at any time, do whatever it wants with it. If they want to suspend, that letter was not a joke. It is actually a serious threat. If South Africa does not comply with those conditions, the US can do that willy-nilly within 24 hours if they want it. That's because of the setup of our great trade arrangements with the US. So my question here is basically, now, post-2025, we are already in it. Do we still want to be in this kind of arrangement where shots are called from one side? And if you feel, realistically or not, that let's say your domestic industry is threatened by your trading partner, and you can't do anything, or if you do, you still get this axe hanging over your neck. So, well, in a nutshell, that's what it means for the next 10 years. But what about beyond that? And now I will discuss some of the reasons why the setup is the way it is, but why it shouldn't be post this period, or at any other point before then. So, what are the trade relations between South Africa and the US and what are the issues that I've just touched on right now in terms of the trade? Let's look at trade in goods between the two countries. Last year, South Africa exported $8.3 billion worth of goods, and this is just goods, commodities. The South African imports from the US were $6.4 billion US dollars. Well, the long and short of it is that we had a trade balance, a net surplus of about $2 billion US dollars. good story, right? This is all commodities, not agriculture. That is what we would like to see more often. And I have to mention that with the US is one of the few partners or few countries that we have a positive trade balance consistently over a period of time. But that is only if you take goods into account. Let's throw in services, the intangibles. And in terms of trade, if you split globally, if you split trade in goods from trade in services, there's a massive difference. Services trade is growing a lot faster than goods trade. South Africa's exports of services to the United States were 1.7 billion, while South Africa imported 3 billion worth of services from the US, and this was in 2013. That is, the latest available information. So we ran a deficit of 1.3 billion in that case. But in addition, the sales of South African-owned firms that are based in the US were worth about 294 million. This was the 2012 statistics. Again, these kind of statistics, they're not easy to come to find. They are not regularly published. Not that they are not available, but we know how information goes, and particularly at this level. The US sales, so US-owned firms that are based in South Africa, in the same period, they made sales of 7.3 billion relative to 294 million. This is in 2012. And I have to maybe explain that SA-owned and US-owned base also includes where majority ownership is by the US or the South African companies in that case. In terms of the US-based, FDI from US companies, it was 2013, there was about 5.2 billion, and these were mainly in manufacturing, wholesale, and services sector. Now, let's look this in perspective. So the goods trade only, South Africa is a net exporter. But when you bring in services and the sales of the companies, then the story quickly changes. Okay? Then you get to have an idea of how that trade relations looks like, and the FDI on the other hand. Now, what about these rocky relationships? People call it a chicken fight, feather fight, and it goes on and on. But it does start with chicken, but later on, I will go into the details of explaining SACU-US negotiations, which started in 2003 and eventually didn't yield to any agreement. There was nothing signed. And I'll discuss what were the contentious issues were, or debatable issues. But in brief, in 1999, South Africa started, or the DTI, ITEC in particular, started the investigations about the dumping of chicken products in the South African market. And basically, there were about 2 or 3 companies which were investigated. And indeed, the conclusion was that there was dumping, basically selling the product at lower than the cost of production or lower than the price in the domestic market. So anti-dumping duties measures were implemented of about just less than 7 rand per kilogram. So anti-dumping duties being a safeguard. So safeguards measures, in order to comply with the WTO, they need to be implemented on a temporary basis. You can't leave them there. So every 5 years, it was required that South Africa revisit that activity. They review and see if whether dumping would occur if they removed those duties. And it took about a year. These kind of investigations, they take a long time because you have to get information from the companies, follow up, check with the current and the prices in the country. Anyways, in 2006, the conclusion was that, yes, the poultry industry will continue to be under threat if they remove the anti-dumping duties of just under 7 rands per kilogram. They adjusted them slightly to 940 cents per kilogram. Then, just before another 5 years could lapse on that review, then South Africa made a submission for the sunset clause, which basically required that going forward, South Africa will just do a review, but the schedule will be set by South Africa rather than following the normal temporary period of every 5 years. So, and well, in 2012, that continued. But fast forward to 2015, AGOA, which is the African Growth Opportunities Act, which is this one-way directional agreement that the United States offers or grants to the developing countries on the continent, sub-Saharan countries. So AGOA was due for a review. Then these issues came about from the US, and a number of states or lobby groups, if you like, which have interest in South African market, raised these issues that, look, one, South Africa is not really that developing or least developed countries like Lesotho and Swaziland or Mali are. And therefore, their benefits under AGOA should not be the same level as those. And secondly, they just have concern with the chicken or the meat treatment in general. And there was more pressure for South Africa to make adjustments on those anti-dumping duties or face a possibility of having its AGOA benefits not extended. Now, what does that mean? So under AGOA, the beneficiaries, the sub-Saharan African countries, they get duty and quota-free access into the United States, or most of them, or on most products. South Africa is not getting those benefits in all products. And I need to add that the AGOA is not only on agricultural side, but it's the whole economy, all products that are produced in the economy. So if South Africa's AGOA preferences were not going to be extended, South Africa would then have to face tariffs like any other country that does not have an agreement with the US would do. And under those circumstances, a number of sectors would really face difficult times. We know the beneficiaries, products such as avocado, citrus, the macadamia nut. There are a number of horticultural products that really benefit the wines under AGOA. So if we didn't get that, there was going to be, negative impact on those products or on the whole economy. So even within South Africa, then there were interesting discussions because now you're putting one industry against each other because you have the motor vehicle sector basically saying that why should we put the whole economy at risk because of chicken products? And then you still have clothing and textiles. You have other agricultural products that are not affected by these anti-dumping duties. So eventually, the agreement was signed in Paris, June 2015, and the US, South Africa conceded to allow 65,000 tons of chicken products from the US. So that quota would come in facing a normal tariff. Beyond the 65,000, then they will face this 940 anti-dumping duty on that. Okay? Then what followed then was the letter that I talked about in November from the US president. But the point is, or the argument I'm trying to make is that we have this preferential scheme with the US. So we almost are begging to have this market access. And we are at the mercy of the grantor, because being a non-reciprocal agreement, it is not negotiated. So it is upon the U.S. goodwill for sub-Saharan African countries to have this market access. But there are other ways of getting market access, probably with even better benefits. However, most importantly, on even grounds where both parties can argue for and against a particular issue without anyone threatening one thing or the other. All right? So now, just quickly going past that is just to look at some of the products that are benefiting under the AGOA and some of the tariffs that, if it weren't for these AGOA preferences, so this red column is the non-ad valorem tariff that they would face if in the absence of AGOA. But most of them, they get in duty-free, so those they don't apply. And just looking at the last 4 years or so, the last 5 years, what basically happened was that some have increased their growth, and most of them, given that AGOA has been in place since 2000, they have increased the exports into the U.S. Products such as macadamia nuts. In the last 4 and 5 years, they have increased the hectares by something like 200%. From 7 hectares, now we're sitting anything between 24 and 30 hectares of this. And you can argue that part of it is that there is a market in the United States, but even though a larger market is still China, but there is that pull factor, the demand pool that exists in the U.S. So that growth is as a result of these sectors taking advantage of that duty-free code of free market, particularly agricultural products. Now quickly let's turn around and look at the U.S., let's just say the poultry trade in South Africa. If you look at production and consumption, the blue bar and the dark bar, in the last 10 years, consumption has been outstripping chicken production. And if you look closer, that gap is increasing. So, or to put it the other way around, 10 years between 2012 and 2002, the growth of chicken imports or consumption of chicken increased by 70%. But the production just could not catch up with the growth in consumption. So a simple story is that if you don't meet the consumption with domestic production, that gap will be filled by someone else. So what kinds of chicken products are we importing? Well, 2 components take a big chunk. So, and this in the last 5 years. You see that the blue here, this is the mechanically deboned meat, which is basically your boneless, to some extent, skinless chicken products. And the orange bar there is bone-in portions. Going back to the U.S., now the anti-dumping duties, they were mostly applied on these products, the bone-in products, and you can see they also contribute a large share of that. But in the last 5 years, who were the main suppliers of all chicken products? So mainly the EU and Brazil. By the way, these suppliers as well, during this period, they also faced anti-dumping duties from South Africa as well. But I think in a large in brief is that we get more meat imports, mainly driven by our demand, given what we've seen in the previous with the previous production consumption trends. But then, when we just focus on the bone-in portions, the ones that attract anti-dumping measures, we see that majority of that in recent years. So since 2010, the EU has actually continued to fill up this space. So what happens is that the imports do not necessarily decline. As we levy anti-dumping duties on one partner, another just comes and take up that place, rather than really getting that effective instrument that raises the prices, the domestic price of an imported good, and then allow the domestic producers to keep up, to be incentivized by the high price. No, what happens is that the supply just shifts from one partner to the other. Well, at least based on this evidence that we're looking at. And within the EU, just a breakdown of which EU countries are filling in that bone-in portions. Netherlands is the main supplier of those products. Okay? So that is, in brief, where we come from, or in the last 15 years, what's been happening, and the trade. The flow of goods is one component. There's another component which is about the relationships, the agreements. We enter into these agreements in order to facilitate trade, in order to open up markets for some goods, or to open a particular market that without an agreement, it will be difficult for your companies to sell their products in there. So we have trade agreements in South Africa, the US has the same, but what are those trade agreements quickly? So on the left side, we have trade agreements with these partners, SACU, SADC, and recently we just signed up the tripartite FTA within 3 regions, COMESA, SADC, and the EAC. So we have the EU TDCA, Trade Development or Cooperation Agreement, which is also at a free trade level. And then we have another one, which is EFTA, European Free Trade Association, which includes 4 countries, Switzerland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. So those are the trade agreements that have been negotiated, completed, and they're being implemented except the tripartite FTA. So what basically means that is that majority of the goods are entering or are exchanging, are taking place free of duties. And I say majority because in terms of percentages, it now gets into that area of it depends, but more than 60%. In the case of the EU, South Africa, we are now at almost 95% duty-free both ways, and SADC also that level. But then, there are other trade agreements that are less ambitious than an FTA. And why do I say they are less ambitious? Is because during the negotiations, not all products that can be exchanged in an economy are negotiated. No. The partners, they sit down before they start the negotiations and say, what products would you open up, and which products would you want me to open up? And then they exchange those lists. Now, this is what happens. You'll see that the second one there is SACU and India. India would say, well, we would be happy to open for most of the sectors in the economy as long as it's not agriculture. And if you accept that, then by the time the negotiations start, you would know that you're not going to negotiate any market access for agriculture. But what happens is that I believe that naturally all countries are mercantilistic. We have the view that exports are great and imports are bad. Imports destroy jobs. And therefore, what tends to happen in these less ambitious trade negotiations is that products that do not matter, they get offered. They would offer a product that, okay, let's take an example of a country that has no aviation industry. And then all the 160 products under aviation, the engines for aeroplanes and all that, they'll say duty-free, and all that. But where it matters the most, let's say agricultural products, it creates jobs, it contributes to rural development, they will say no, this is a sensitive sector. And this is what happens in these agreements. In any case, we have started negotiations with two. The Mercosur, which is a South American group consisting of Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina, with Chile as an observer. And then we have another one with India. They are not even yet concluded, as far as I know. And these have been going on for over a decade. And then you have the non-reciprocal agreements, which AGOA is one. EU used to give the same thing before the EPAs were negotiated under the GPS Cotonou agreement. So all African countries or former colonies of United Kingdom and France, they used to have that kind of one-way directional non-reciprocal agreement, but obviously it had to be phased out for a number of reasons. But now, on this side, the intention was to focus on the issues that South Africa, if you look at all agreements that South Africa has, basically completed and negotiated, there is a particular pattern in terms of how the interests are presented and in what areas. So I have summarized them in this sense that one is mainly goods. Well, let me put it this way. It is only goods. Except in the case of SADC, when the protocol was signed, services trade was one of those that was going to be negotiated. But at the end, services fell apart. And SADC free trade now only talks about movements of goods, no services. Emphasis is on tariff reduction, meaning market access is viewed from the point of view that if we remove tariffs, then we may have that thing that would stimulate our exports. Our export would flourish on the basis that tariffs are no more or they've been reduced to manageable level. I'm not so sure that is the case, but nevertheless, that is what you get if you really follow strictly the agreements. Then you have the job creation, employment. And that is even more observable if you look at South Africa's defensive approach. So when a negotiating partner sends a list of sectors and subsectors where we need to reduce our tariffs in order to increase market access for them, there are certain sectors that are labor intensive. And in that case, South Africa is very, very careful not to open or not to be that, let me say, generous for now in giving the negotiating partner access to those. And you probably would be aware of those. Clothing and textiles, motor vehicle sector, the sugar. And of late, the attention in terms of partners seems to be more on the developing countries and less towards the developed countries. And that is debatable, but that is the observation that I get now. Now, let's quickly look at what U.S. does. What are the U.S. interests? What is it that the U.S. seem to look into when they enter into these agreements? Okay? All right. Before we go there, let's just look quickly at what happened between SACU-US Trade negotiations. This started around June of 2003. And for a period of more than 5 years, these negotiations were ongoing. But at the end, as I said at the beginning, that the agreement was not signed. Some of the main contentious issues, or one of the main contentious issues really, is the intellectual property rights. And this is the area where the US is very, its interest become clear from the onset that issues around patents, copyrights, they need to be in there. And the implication is not only that if you agree, then you will respect those rights from the US companies. It also means that if another country violates the US intellectual property rights in your own market, you have a duty to defend US interests in your own country, in that market. And there were labor issues and pharmaceutical issues which were also part of that. And from the SACU's side, well, let me just say South Africa. I don't think Lesotho, Botswana, and Swaziland were that vocal about these issues around employment. The issue of employment, as I said in my previous slide, that was actually at the core and the heart of South Africa, that we will be destroying jobs if we go beyond this. There were other issues around services, again, which were problematic from South Africa's point of view. But if you remember around 2004, 2005, with the issues of AIDS and antiretrovirals, they were and they still are eating a huge chunk of our health budget. Now, you have an option of getting a patented drug or a generic. And we have new friends in the BRICS who can provide a drug that has the same effect, well, not necessarily no name, but that would be cheaper than the patented drugs. And given what was going on our budget, I think that was among other things that made it very difficult for South Africa to make a commitment, first to increase their health budget due to this agreement, but secondly, to have to defend this against our new best friends from the BRICS. But at the end, the members agreed or settled for a trade and investment cooperation agreement, which is basically a memorandum of understanding, for lack of a better word, basically saying that on the areas where we have the same interests, we'll sit, discuss on the investment and other issues, then we'll look into cooperation. But there are no enforcement mechanism. The obligations are pretty low, I'll put it that way. Okay? Now, let's look what the US does. US has close to 20 free trade agreements with countries and groups. And if you look at them, pretty much all of them have something on services, on intellectual property, on government procurement, meaning some of the issues that are much deeper than just tariffs and trade in goods. And currently now, this is actually even more of a concern for the future. So the US is negotiating two major trade agreements. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP is called, with the Asia-Pacific countries, and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership with the EU. Believe it or not, for all this period, US and EU had no agreement of this nature. And if you just look at the issues that are mentioned there, they go way beyond what South Africa currently has. And if you listen to the tone, there is no indication that we would be moving closer to those issues. And if these two are signed, we are talking about more than 2/3 of world trade involves or goes through these countries. So that has massive impact because some of these countries are our partners. We have trade agreement with the EU, which means that if this goes through, the products that we were more competitive on relative to the US, so the margin will get closer, if not US even getting a better deal than we currently have. And vice versa. Countries like Chile are very strong on agricultural trade. Now we're going to compete with Chile, although Chile already has an agreement, but there is that drive to compete now under much stronger competitive contention in the US than we currently do even with AGOA. So those are some of the concerns that if the US goes ahead and signs this, and yet where we are, we rely on the grant, there is something in the future that might just affect our global competitiveness. Okay, the WTO. Why don't we run to the WTO when we have this disagreement? Well, first because we have to try and sort it out ourselves. But secondly, because more often there is no clear violation of the WTO rules in the issues that involve South Africa and the US up to so far. But that can be debatable. But if there is that scope, Brazil did that in 2012 when we imposed anti-dumping duties on their chicken. But the WTO has not moved that much in the last 15 years. It hasn't really ensured that the current round of negotiation is concluded, and it doesn't seem like in the next few years that round will be concluded. So in other words, relying or waiting on the WTO to be the savior, if it can be, is a bit dangerous. So hence I'm saying in future it's unlikely that the WTO will provide any consolation or solution to some of the challenges that we face. Let me go back to what I said about the blog, what I put on the blog, why South Africa needs the US, and some of the reasons I mentioned. But if you consider the US to be a global benchmark, that if you want to test yourself against how competitive you can be, you probably need the US standard. But we can also do better than AGOA by basically ensuring that we get a trade agreement that is not one-sided. But that depends upon us knowing exactly what we want. What do we want to do really with trade? How do we want to move our economy, which is currently, we know that since 2009, we haven't gone above 2.5. Do we still have that export-led ambition that if we open markets, then we can produce more and play a major role in most markets, and then that would stimulate economic activity in our country? Because if that is still the case, then we need to have an answer of post-2025, whether US wants us to have an agreement or not, either a handout or a negotiated settlement. We're the one who's supposed to determine our own path, our own vision. As I said, so now we're locked between this. And in that path, does it include the US? If it includes the US, should it be on the terms that the US set, as it is the case now with AGOA? Or do we want to have an equal say in that? My sense is we may not go there, given that, one, we are at different places in terms of our approaches to the trade agreements. The US is ambitious. It goes beyond goods. It goes into procurement, competition. It tackles issues, obviously intellectual property rights, they are very strong domestically, so it's not a surprise that they are insisting on those. But you can argue, given our experience, based on what we have done so far, we are less ambitious relative to the United States. We are still goods-centered in terms of our trade agreements. We are concerned about sensitive products, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about job losses, but is our defensive approach the only way to sustain those jobs? Or put it the other way around, we're still losing jobs in those areas, even when we don't sign agreements on services and other areas. And the reason I say we are less ambitious, think about if you go up north, well, passing the Limpopo province. On Tuesday, somebody said that Limpopo province shares the border with at least 3 countries, and they counted Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and provinces of South Africa. So if we go past Limpopo, you would find South African retailers, service businesses, mining, banks, you go on and on the continent. Already we're there. And by and large, we are the largest exporter on the continent of those services. However, even in the context of SADC and the tripartite FTA, we couldn't show a little bit of ambition in signing an agreement while we're still a step ahead, while we're still competitive. So, and for sure there are reasons, but I'm just concerned that post this period, we may find that we missed an opportunity unless we really try to decide now what is it that we want to see in 2030 or 2050 in terms of our trade. But if we're going to focus on goods and tariffs, I think the world would pass us by. Quickly on the WTO, I've already indicated that we're not going to be running to the WTO every time because their processes are slow, but also because that the issues that are contentious are not yet concluded by the WTO. If you look at the GATS, you look at the TRIPS, they are still left to member states to decide how they should be rather than have those measures regulated by the WTO. But we need to decide our own future. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So will we continue to rely, if we say US, we need US in this package, in this growth package, export-led growth package. Do we still need the US in that? And if so, would it be under the US terms, or are we going to negotiate with the US? And if we negotiate with the US, are we prepared to open up on all those issues that US hardly ever compromise on them? But hey, we have new friends somewhere. Maybe they are an alternative. I'm not so sure. But even if they are an alternative, yes, an alternative they should be, but they shouldn't be everything that we need in the trade strategy. And I think that is where I leave it with those 2 questions. Thanks very much.